The conference room felt like it was shrinking around me as I watched my sister Rachel lean forward across the mahogany table, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the surface as she spoke directly to Marcus Wellington, CEO of Wellington Industries, the same Marcus Wellington I'd been trying to secure a meeting with for 8 months. The same man who held the key to a $12 million contract that would transform my consulting firm from a promising startup into a major player. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I have to be honest with you, Marcus, Rachel said, her voice carrying that syrupy tone she'd perfected since joining Wellington Industries as their director of strategic partnerships 6 months ago. My sister Jessa has always been ambitious. Sometimes too ambitious for her own good. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't how the presentation was supposed to go. This wasn't how any of this was supposed to happen. 20 minutes earlier, I'd walked into Wellington Industries' downtown Chicago headquarters carrying 3 years of research, market analysis, and strategic planning. My proposal for revolutionizing their supply chain management wasn't just comprehensive, it was brilliant. I'd identified inefficiencies that were costing them millions annually, and I had the solutions that would not only save money, but position them as industry leaders in sustainable logistics. Rachel had been waiting in the lobby when I arrived, dressed in her trademark navy blazer and that smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Surprise!" she'd said, giving me a hug that felt more like a performance. "I thought I'd sit in on your big presentation. Moral support, you know." I should have said no. Every instinct in my body screamed that this was wrong. But Rachel was family. She was my older sister, the one who'd supposedly helped me get this meeting in the first place by putting in a good word with her boss. How could I exclude her from what could be the biggest moment of my career? Now, sitting in Wellington's corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, I was beginning to understand exactly how much I'd underestimated my sister's capacity for betrayal. "The thing is," Rachel continued, completely ignoring the fact that I was sitting right there, "Jess's company is still quite small. Just her and a couple of freelancers, really. I'm not sure they have the infrastructure to handle a contract of this magnitude." Marcus Wellington leaned back in his leather chair, his gray eyes shifting between Rachel and me. At 62, he had the kind of presence that commanded attention: silver hair, expensive suit, and the confident demeanor of someone who'd built a billion-dollar empire from nothing. He'd been polite but distant when I'd started my presentation, but now he seemed genuinely engaged. Unfortunately, it was Rachel who had his attention. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice neutral but his interest clearly piqued. I opened my mouth to speak, to defend my company and clarify the scope of my operation, but Rachel wasn't finished. "Don't get me wrong," she said with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "I love my little sister dearly, but you know how it is with family. Businesses, sometimes emotions cloud judgment. Jessa's been struggling to find her footing since she left Morrison & Associates." That was a lie. A complete calculated lie. I hadn't been struggling since leaving Morrison & Associates 18 months ago. I'd been strategic. I'd left the corporate, consulting world because I wanted to build something of my own, something that reflected my values and my vision for how business could be done better. My client list might have been smaller than Morrison's, but every single client had seen measurable improvements in their operations. "Rachel," I said, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest, "I think there might be some misunderstanding about—" "Oh, sweetie," Rachel interrupted, turning to me with that condescending smile I'd seen 1,000 times growing up. "I'm just being realistic. Marcus needs to know what he's getting into." She turned back to Wellington, and I watched in horror as she began systematically dismantling everything I'd worked for. The truth is, Jessa's had some setbacks recently. Her last major client, Hartwell Manufacturing, didn't renew their contract. And there were some issues with project delivery timelines that I think Marcus should be aware of. Another lie. Hartwell Manufacturing hadn't renewed because they'd been acquired by a larger company that brought all consulting in-house. It had nothing to do with my performance. In fact, they'd written me a glowing recommendation letter that was sitting in my portfolio, which Rachel had obviously never bothered to read. But Marcus Wellington didn't know that. He was seeing a young woman whose own sister was raising red flags about her competence and reliability. He was seeing exactly what Rachel wanted him to see. Additionally, Rachel continued, pulling out her phone and scrolling through what looked like prepared notes, I have some concerns about the financial projections in Jessa's proposal. The numbers seem optimistic. Almost unrealistic, if I'm being honest. I felt something snap inside me. Those projections weren't optimistic. They were conservative. I'd run the numbers 17 different ways, had them reviewed by 3 independent analysts, and stress-tested them against worst-case scenarios. Every single calculation was backed by hard data and proven methodologies, but Rachel wasn't interested in facts. She was interested in sabotage. I'm sorry, I said, standing up abruptly. The leather chair scraped against the floor, and both Rachel and Marcus looked at me with surprise. I need to clarify something here. Marcus gestured for me to continue, his expression unreadable. First, I said, my voice gaining strength with each word, my company isn't just me and a couple of freelancers. I have a core team of 5 full-time employees, all with advanced degrees and specialized expertise. We also maintain relationships with a network of contracted specialists that allows us to scale rapidly when needed. Rachel's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. Jessa, I don't think... Second, I continued, not letting her interrupt. The Hartwell Manufacturing contract ended due to their acquisition, not performance issues. They provided a written recommendation that specifically praised our ability to deliver ahead of schedule and under budget. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out the letter, sliding it across the table to Marcus. His eyebrows raised slightly as he scanned the document. And third, I said, my voice now carrying the full weight of 3 years of expertise and preparation, my financial projections aren't optimistic. They're conservative. I'd be happy to walk you through the methodology and supporting data in detail. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic 20 floors below. Marcus set down the recommendation letter and looked directly at me for the first time since Rachel had started her character assassination. Please do, he said simply. For the next 45 minutes, I presented my actual proposal. Not the abbreviated version I'd started with, but the comprehensive analysis that demonstrated exactly how Wellington Industries could save $8 million annually while improving their environmental impact and customer satisfaction scores. I walked through case studies, showed comparative analyses with their competitors, and outlined implementation timelines that accounted for every possible contingency. Marcus asked pointed questions, the kind that showed he understood both the complexity of the challenges and the elegance of my solutions. He was clearly impressed, and more importantly, he was convinced. Rachel sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence as it became obvious that her attempt to undermine me had backfired spectacularly. Every lie she'd told was being systematically disproven by my actual work, my actual results, and my actual expertise. This is impressive work, Jessa, Marcus said finally, closing the portfolio I'd given him. Very impressive. The level of detail and strategic thinking is exactly what we're looking for. I felt a surge of vindication, but it was tempered by the betrayal still burning in my chest. My own sister had tried to destroy my career in front of the most important client I'd ever pitched to. However, Marcus continued, and my heart began to sink. I do have some concerns about the working relationship, given what Rachel has shared about your professional challenges. Rachel's smile returned, sharp and triumphant. Actually, Marcus, I said, my voice calm despite the storm of emotions inside me. I think you should know something about those professional challenges Rachel mentioned. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, scrolling to the recording app I'd started when I'd first felt something was wrong about this meeting. In Illinois, recording conversations was legal as long as one party consented, and I definitely consented to recording my own business meeting. "What are you doing?" Rachel asked, her voice suddenly uncertain. "I'm playing back the part of this meeting where you told Marcus that I was struggling to find my footing, that I had project delivery issues with Hartwell, and that my financial projections were unrealistic," I said, pressing play. Rachel's voice filled the room, crystal clear and undeniably damaging. "The thing is, Jess's company is still quite small, just her and a couple of freelancers, really." Marcus Wellington's expression changed as he listened to his director of strategic partnerships systematically lie about a potential business partner. His jaw tightened with each fabrication, and by the time the recording reached Rachel's comments about unrealistic financial projections, his face had gone completely stone. "Turn it off," Rachel said quietly. "The truth is, Jess has had some setbacks recently," her recorded voice continued. "Turn it off!" Rachel snapped, reaching for my phone. I pulled it back and stopped the recording myself. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus Wellington slowly turned to look at Rachel, and I could see 20 years of business experience and leadership settling into his features like armor. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "Rachel," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "would you mind explaining to me why you just lied to me about your sister's qualifications and track record?" Rachel's face had gone pale, but she lifted her chin in defiance. "I wasn't lying. I was expressing legitimate concerns about— You told me she was struggling when she clearly isn't. You told me she had delivery problems when her client reference letter says the opposite. You told me her projections were unrealistic when they're actually conservative." His voice was getting colder with each word. "In my experience, when someone goes to that much trouble to sabotage a family member's business proposal, it's not about legitimate concerns." "Marcus, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," he said, standing up from his chair. "You're in charge of strategic partnerships for this company. Your job is to help me identify the best possible partners and vendors, not to eliminate competition through character assassination." The word competition hung in the air like a neon sign. That's what this was about. Rachel hadn't been trying to protect Marcus from a bad business decision. She'd been trying to protect herself from being outshone by her younger sister. "Pack your office," Marcus said to Rachel, his voice devoid of emotion. "Security will escort you out. Your employment with Wellington Industries is terminated immediately." Rachel stood frozen for a moment, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find words that would undo what had just happened. Finally, she turned to me with pure venom in her eyes. "You recorded me," she hissed. "Your own sister." "You lied about me," I replied calmly. "To my biggest potential client." She grabbed her purse and stalked toward the door, but paused with her hand on the handle. "This isn't over, Jessa. Family is family. You'll regret this." "No," I said, feeling a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. "I really won't." The door slammed behind her, leaving Marcus and me alone in the suddenly spacious conference room. Marcus returned to his chair and looked at me with something that might have been respect. "I have to ask," he said, "why did you record the meeting?" "Because I know my sister," I said simply. "And I knew something was wrong the moment she showed up uninvited to my presentation." He nodded slowly. "Good instincts. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need for this project." He opened my portfolio again and studied the implementation timeline. $12 million over 3 years, he said. "When can you start?" I felt my heart stop. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying congratulations, Jessa. You've got the contract." As I sat there in that conference room, watching Marcus Wellington initial the preliminary agreement that would transform my business and my life, I realized that Rachel had done me the biggest favor she'd ever done. She'd shown me exactly who she was, and she'd done it in front of the one person whose opinion mattered most. She'd tried to destroy my reputation to protect her own position, but instead, she'd destroyed her career and handed me everything I'd worked for. The only question now was what would happen when she realized that this was just the beginning. 3 hours after signing the preliminary contract with Wellington Industries, I sat in my downtown office overlooking Grant Park, staring at the signatures that would change everything. But instead of celebrating, I found myself replaying every interaction I'd ever had with Rachel, searching for the moment when sibling rivalry had transformed into something much darker. The truth was, this wasn't the first time Rachel had tried to undermine me. It was just the first time I'd been prepared for it. Growing up in Naperville, Rachel had always been the golden child. 3 years older, she'd established herself early as the academic achiever, the social butterfly, the daughter who never caused problems. I was the creative one, the dreamer, the sister who asked too many questions and colored outside the lines. Our parents, David and Margaret Chen Morrison, had always made it clear which approach they preferred. Rachel's practical, Mom would say whenever I brought up ideas that seemed too ambitious or unconventional. She thinks things through. Maybe you should ask her for advice. By the time I was in high school, I'd learned to keep my bigger dreams to myself. When I got accepted to Northwestern for business administration, Rachel made sure to mention to everyone at my graduation party that Northwestern had lowered their standards recently. When I landed my first internship at Morrison & Associates, she casually informed our parents that the company was known for hiring charity cases to improve their diversity statistics. It was always subtle. Never obvious enough to call out directly, but persistent enough to chip away at my confidence year after year. The pattern had continued through college and into our early careers. When I got promoted to senior consultant at Morrison & Associates, Rachel mentioned to our family that promotions there didn't mean as much because it was a smaller firm. When I started dating Michael Torres, a brilliant software engineer, Rachel made sure to point out that he seemed nice, but probably wasn't ambitious enough for someone with my career goals. Michael and I had broken up 6 months later, partly because I'd started believing Rachel's subtle suggestions that he was holding me back. Looking back now, I realized that Michael had been one of the few people who'd consistently supported my entrepreneurial ambitions. Rachel had eliminated him from my life with surgical precision, but it was the way she'd handled my decision to leave Morrison & Associates that should have been my wake-up call. I'd been planning my exit strategy for months, carefully building a client base and developing the expertise I'd need to launch my own consulting firm. I'd saved money, researched business licenses, and even secured initial funding from a small business loan. Everything was falling into place. I made the mistake of sharing my excitement with Rachel over dinner at our favorite Thai restaurant in Lincoln Park. "I'm finally ready to take the leap," I told her, practically bouncing in my seat. "I've got 3 potential clients lined up, and Morrison said they'd be happy to provide references. I'm thinking of calling it Chen Strategic Solutions." Rachel had smiled and raised her glass of wine in a toast. "That's amazing, Jess. I'm so proud of you for following your dreams." 2 weeks later, I discovered that she'd called Morrison & Associates, managing partner, and expressed concern about my plans. "She's worried that you might be taking proprietary information when you leave," Morrison's partner had told me during what was supposed to be a routine exit interview. "And she mentioned that you've been struggling with some personal issues. That might affect your judgment." I'd been blindsided. Morrison & Associates had suddenly become suspicious of my motives, demanding that I sign additional non-compete agreements and submit to an invasive audit of my computer files. The references they'd promised became lukewarm at best, and one of my potential clients mysteriously decided to go with a more established firm. When I confronted Rachel about it, she'd seemed genuinely hurt by my accusations. "Jess, I never said anything like that. I just mentioned that you seemed stressed about starting your own business, and I was worried about you taking on too much too fast. I was trying to look out for you. She'd been so convincing, so wounded by my suspicion, that I'd actually apologized for doubting her motives. That's how good she was at manipulation. She could sabotage me and then make me feel guilty for noticing. But I'd learned from that experience. I'd become more careful about what I shared with Rachel, more strategic about protecting my plans. Which is why, when I'd started pursuing the Wellington Industries contract 8 months ago, I'd kept the details to myself. Or so I'd thought. Sitting in my office now, I pulled up the emails I'd exchanged with Rachel over the past year, looking for clues about how she'd known so much about my Wellington proposal. The answer was buried in a casual conversation we'd had over coffee 3 months ago. "Work's been crazy lately," I'd mentioned, stirring my latte. "I'm working on this huge proposal that could really transform the business if it goes through." "That's exciting," Rachel had said. "What kind of proposal?" I'd been vague, just mentioning that it was a supply chain optimization project for a major manufacturer. I hadn't mentioned Wellington Industries by name, hadn't shared any specific details about the contract value or timeline. But Rachel worked for Wellington Industries. She would have known immediately which proposal I was talking about. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Rachel hadn't just happened to be available to sit in on my presentation. She'd been systematically gathering intelligence about my business for months, positioning herself to interfere at the crucial moment. I scrolled back further through our text conversations, looking for other instances where she'd probed for information about my work. They were everywhere, disguised as sisterly interest and casual conversation. "How's the new client search going?" she'd asked in February. "Any interesting projects coming up?" She'd texted in March. "You seem stressed about work lately. Anything I can help with?" She'd written in April. Each seemingly innocent question had been a fishing expedition, and I'd answered them all because she was my sister. Because I'd wanted to believe that despite our complicated history, Rachel genuinely cared about my success. The evidence was overwhelming. Rachel hadn't just tried to sabotage my Wellington presentation on a whim. She'd been planning it for months, gathering information and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But why? That's what I couldn't understand. Rachel had a good job at Wellington Industries. She was successful in her own right, well respected in her field. Why did she need to destroy my opportunities to feel secure on her own? The answer came to me as I was packing up my office for the day. On my bookshelf, tucked behind a stack of industry reports, was a photo from Rachel's college graduation. The whole family was there: Mom, Dad, Rachel in her cap and gown, and me standing slightly off to the side, smiling but somehow separate from the group. I remembered that day clearly. Rachel had just graduated summa cum laude from University of Illinois with a degree in business administration. She'd already secured a position at a prestigious consulting firm in Chicago, and our parents couldn't stop talking about how proud they were. I'd been genuinely happy for her success, but I'd also made the mistake of mentioning that I was thinking about switching my major from marketing to entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship? Dad had laughed. "That's not a real major, Jess. That's what people study when they can't handle the rigor of actual business courses. Rachel's going to be working with Fortune 500 companies," Mom had added. "She's going to be making a real impact in the business world." The implication was clear. Rachel was the serious sister, the one who would achieve meaningful success. I was the dreamer who needed to be more realistic about my capabilities. But now, 8 years later, I was the one with the $12 million contract. I was the one who'd built something from nothing, who'd taken the risks and done the work to create genuine value in the marketplace. Rachel was still working for someone else, still following someone else's vision instead of creating her own. For the first time in our relationship, I was succeeding in a way that she couldn't dismiss or diminish. And that success had become such a threat to her identity as the successful sister that she'd been willing to destroy my business to protect her own sense of superiority. The pattern was clear now. Every time I'd achieved something meaningful, Rachel had found a way to undermine it or explain it away. Every time I'd shown potential that might rival her own accomplishments, she'd intervened to redirect my path or damage my confidence. She'd convinced me that Michael wasn't ambitious enough. But the real problem was that he'd encouraged my ambitions. She'd sabotaged my exit from Morrison & Associates because she couldn't let me succeed independently. And she'd tried to destroy my Wellington presentation because my success would have made her look small by comparison. For 28 years, I'd been living my life in Rachel's shadow, accepting her judgment of my potential and capabilities. I'd internalized her subtle criticisms until they became my own voice, questioning every decision and second-guessing every instinct. But today, something had shifted. When I'd played that recording in Marcus Wellington's office, I hadn't just been defending my business proposal. I'd been refusing to accept Rachel's version of reality. I'd been choosing my own narrative over her manipulation. The Wellington contract wasn't just a business success. It was proof that I'd been right to trust my own abilities, right to take risks, right to believe that I could build something meaningful. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Congratulations on your big win today. Some of us saw this coming from miles away." "A friend at Wellington?" I smiled, realizing that Rachel's sabotage attempt had probably been witnessed by more people than just Marcus. Her reputation at Wellington Industries was likely destroyed beyond repair, while mine was just beginning to take shape. Another message appeared, this one from my former colleague at Morrison & Associates. "Heard through the grapevine that you landed Wellington Industries. That's incredible, Jess. Always knew you had it in you." Then another from my college roommate. "LinkedIn is blowing up with news about your Wellington contract. So proud of you for following your dreams." Word was spreading fast through Chicago's business community. By tomorrow, everyone would know that Jessa Chen had landed one of the biggest consulting contracts of the year. Rachel's attempt to make me look incompetent had backfired so spectacularly that it was actually amplifying my success. As I locked up my office and headed for the elevator, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete confidence in my own judgment. Rachel had spent decades conditioning me to doubt myself, to defer to her wisdom, to accept her assessment of my limitations. But I'd just proven that I could succeed despite her interference, not because of her guidance. I'd built a business that could compete with established firms, develop solutions that impressed industry leaders, and navigate complex professional relationships with skill and integrity. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, watching. The floors count down toward the lobby. Each number felt like another layer of Rachel's influence falling away, another year of self-doubt being left behind. By the time I reached the ground floor, I was already planning my next move. The Wellington contract was just the beginning. I had ideas for expanding into new markets, developing innovative service offerings, building partnerships with other independent consultants who shared my vision for ethical, effective business practices. Rachel had tried to limit my potential to protect her own status. Instead, she'd forced me to recognize exactly how limitless that potential really was. The pattern of sabotage was finally broken. Now it was time to see what I could build without someone constantly trying to tear it down. The call came at 6:47 a.m. the next morning. I was in my kitchen, grinding coffee beans and mentally preparing for what I knew would be a pivotal day, when my phone started buzzing with an incoming call from Mom. I stared at the screen for a moment, already knowing what this conversation would be about. Rachel had clearly gone running to our parents, spinning her version of yesterday's events. The question was whether I was ready to hear it. I answered on the fourth ring. "Jessica Marie Chen Morrison." Mom's voice came through the speaker with that particular tone that meant I was in serious trouble. She only used my full name when she was channeling her disappointment into formal authority. What did you do to your sister? Not, how are you doing? Or, congratulations on your big contract. Just immediate accusation, as if I'd committed some unforgivable crime against family loyalty. Good morning to you too, Mom, I said, taking a sip of my coffee. I'm doing well, thanks for asking. Just landed the biggest contract of my career. Yesterday? Don't be smart with me, young lady. Rachel is devastated. She called me crying at midnight, saying you got her fired from her job. She said you recorded her without permission and twisted her words to make her look bad in front of her boss. I felt that familiar sensation, the automatic guilt response that Rachel and my parents had conditioned into me over decades. The impulse to apologize, to minimize what had happened, to take responsibility for Rachel's actions to preserve family peace. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the coffee. Maybe it was the Wellington contract sitting on my kitchen counter. Or maybe it was finally having concrete evidence of Rachel's manipulation. Whatever it was, I didn't feel the usual need to shrink myself to make everyone else comfortable. Mom, I said calmly, Rachel lied to my potential client about my professional qualifications and track record. She tried to sabotage a business presentation that I'd been working toward for 8 months. I have it all on recording. Recording your own sister. How could you be so calculating, so cold? How could she be so willing to destroy my career? I shot back, surprised by the strength in my own voice. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Dad's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. Your father wants to know if you're going to fix this, Mom said finally. Rachel says she might be able to get her job back if you call her boss and explain that. There was a misunderstanding. I set down my coffee cup and walked to my living room window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows between the buildings. Somewhere out there, Marcus Wellington was probably already in his office, reviewing contracts and making decisions that would affect thousands of people's livelihoods. He'd trusted me with a $12 million project because I'd proven I could deliver results and handle complex challenges with integrity. And my parents wanted me to call him and lie about what had happened so Rachel could get her job back. No, I said simply. What do you mean, no? I mean, no, I'm not going to call Marcus Wellington and tell him there was a misunderstanding. There wasn't a misunderstanding. Rachel deliberately tried to sabotage my presentation with false information about my business and my track record. She got fired because she violated the basic trust required for her position. Jessica, she's your sister. Family comes first. Those 4 words, family comes first, had been the soundtrack of my childhood. They'd been used to justify every sacrifice I'd made, every dream I'd set aside, every time I'd been expected to accommodate Rachel's needs at the expense of my own. But as I stood there in my apartment, surrounded by the evidence of what I'd built through my own hard work and determination, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. Rachel had never been asked to put family first when it came to supporting my goals. Mom, I said, when I was planning to leave Morrison & Associates, Rachel called my boss and raised concerns about my intentions. That damaged my professional reputation and cost me potential clients. Did you ask her to fix that because family comes first? Silence. When I was dating Michael Torres, Rachel constantly undermined our relationship with subtle criticisms and suggestions that he wasn't good enough for me. We broke up partly because I started believing her. Did you ask her to apologize and help me reconcile with him because family comes first? More silence. When I mentioned at Rachel's graduation that I was thinking about studying entrepreneurship, Dad laughed and said it wasn't a real major. You said Rachel was going to make a real impact while implying that I was just a dreamer. Did either of you ever think that maybe you should support my ambitions because family comes first? That's different, Mom said weakly. How is it different? Rachel she was trying to help you be realistic about your goals. She didn't want you to get hurt by aiming too high. and there it was. The fundamental belief that had shaped my entire family dynamic. Rachel's success was something to be protected and celebrated, while my success was something to be managed and contained. "Mom," I said, feeling a clarity that was both liberating and terrifying. "Rachel tried to destroy my business yesterday. Not because she was trying to help me, but because my success threatened her sense of superiority. She's been doing this for years, and you've been enabling it because you've never believed I was capable of achieving anything that might rival her accomplishments. That's not true. It is true, and I'm done pretending otherwise." I hung up the phone and stood in the silence of my apartment, waiting for the guilt to hit, waiting for the familiar voice in my head that would tell me I'd been too harsh, too confrontational, too selfish. But the guilt didn't come. Instead, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete alignment between my values and my actions. I wasn't being mean to Rachel or disrespectful to my parents. I was simply refusing to participate in a dynamic that required me to minimize my own success to make other people comfortable. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. "I can't believe you won't help me fix this. After everything I've done for you." I stared at that message for a long moment, trying to think of a single thing Rachel had genuinely done for me that didn't serve her own interests. She'd helped me get the meeting with Marcus Wellington, but only because she worked there and wanted to position herself as the gatekeeper of my access to the company. She'd offered advice about my business decisions, but only to steer me away from choices that might lead to success she couldn't control or diminish. Even her supposed support for my entrepreneurial goals had been conditional and undermining. She'd congratulate me on small victories while questioning whether I was ready for bigger challenges. She'd celebrate my independence while subtly suggesting that I needed her guidance to avoid making mistakes. For the first time in our relationship, I saw Rachel's behavior with complete clarity. She didn't want me to fail. That would have been too obvious. She wanted me to succeed just enough to validate her role as my superior, but never enough to threaten her position as the family success. Story. Yesterday's sabotage hadn't been about protecting Marcus Wellington from a bad business decision. It had been about protecting Rachel from the reality that her little sister had developed expertise, connections, and capabilities that rivaled or exceeded her own. I typed back, "What you've done for me is show me exactly who you are. That's actually been very helpful." Then I blocked her number. Over the next few hours, I received calls from my Aunt Linda, my cousin Brett, and my grandmother. The family phone tree was clearly in full swing, with everyone being recruited to convince me to apologize to Rachel and fix the situation. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Initial concern for my well-being, followed by gentle pressure to be the bigger person, followed by increasingly direct demands that I prioritize family harmony over professional integrity. "You know how sensitive Rachel is," Aunt Linda said. "She's always looked up to you." "Rachel has never looked up to me," I replied. "She spent our entire relationship making sure I looked up to her." "That's not how I remember it." "That's because you've only seen the version of our relationship that Rachel wanted you to see." By the time my grandmother called, the final authority in our family hierarchy, I was prepared for the full court press. "Sweetheart," Grandma Betty said in her gentle Iowa accent, "I know you're angry with Rachel right now, but you need to think about the bigger picture. Jobs come and go, but family is forever." "Grandma," I said, "I love you and I respect your opinion. But Rachel didn't just cost me a job opportunity. She tried to destroy my professional reputation based on lies. If I let that slide, I'm telling her that she can sabotage me whenever my success makes her uncomfortable. Maybe she made a mistake, but it wasn't a mistake. It was calculated and deliberate. She's been gathering information about my business for months, positioning herself to interfere at the crucial moment. This was planned." There was a long pause. Grandma Betty had always been the wisest person in our family, the one who could see through pretense and manipulation better than anyone else. "You recorded her," she said finally. I did. Why? Because I know Rachel. I knew something was wrong the moment she showed up uninvited to my presentation. My instincts told me to protect myself, and I listened to them. Another pause. You've always been the smart one in this family, Grandma said quietly. Smarter than your parents gave you credit for. Smarter than Rachel wanted to admit. I felt tears prick at my eyes. In 31 years, I'd never heard anyone in my family acknowledge that I might have intelligence or capabilities that deserved recognition. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, Grandma continued. But this is going to get ugly before it gets better. Are you prepared for that? I don't know, I admitted. But I'm more prepared for it than I am for spending the rest of my life apologizing for my own success. Good, she said. Then you'll be fine. After I hung up with Grandma, I sat in my kitchen and made a list of everything I knew about my situation. I had a $12 million contract with Wellington Industries. Rachel had been fired for cause and would likely not be rehired. My parents and extended family expected me to sacrifice my professional integrity to repair Rachel's situation. I was being positioned as the villain in a story where I was actually the victim. I had a choice to make about what kind of person I wanted to be going forward. That last point was the crucial one. I could apologize, make excuses for Rachel's behavior, and try to restore the family harmony that had always been purchased with my silence and accommodation. Or I could accept that choosing my own integrity meant accepting the consequences of other people's discomfort with that choice. I thought about Marcus Wellington's face when he'd heard Rachel's lies played back to him. The disgust hadn't been directed at me. It had been directed at someone who would abuse their position and family relationship to sabotage a business opportunity. He'd seen Rachel's behavior as fundamentally incompatible with the values he expected from his employees. Thought about my business, the team I was building, the clients who trusted me to deliver results with honesty and expertise. If I called Marcus and lied about what had happened, I'd be proving that I was exactly the kind of person Rachel had portrayed me as. Someone whose judgment was compromised by family drama. Someone who couldn't be trusted to maintain professional boundaries. I thought about the next 20 years of my life and whether I wanted to spend them walking on eggshells around Rachel's fragile ego, managing her jealousy and resentment, accepting her sabotage as the price of family membership. The answer was clear. I opened my laptop and began drafting an email to my entire extended family. Not an apology or an explanation, but a statement of my position and my boundaries going forward. To my family, I wrote, I understand that you're upset about Rachel's situation, and I'm sorry that she's going through a difficult time. However, I will not apologize for defending my professional reputation against false accusations, and I will not compromise my integrity to repair damage that Rachel caused through her own choices. I love all of you, but I'm no longer willing to minimize my success or hide my capabilities to make other people comfortable. If that makes me the villain in this story, I can live with that. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Within minutes, my phone started buzzing with responses. I turned it off and went for a run along Lake Michigan, letting the rhythm of my feet on the pavement and the sound of waves against the shore clear my head. When I got back to my apartment an hour later, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete ownership of my own life. No guilt, no second-guessing, no anxiety about other people's approval. I was ready to see what I could build when I stopped asking permission to succeed. The first consequence of my email came within 48 hours. I was in my office reviewing the Wellington Industries implementation timeline when my assistant, Maya, knocked on my door with an expression I'd never seen before. Part confusion, part concern. Jessa, she said, closing the door behind her, there's a woman here who says she's your sister. She's asking to speak with you, but she seems upset. Should I call security? Through my office window, I could see Rachel in the reception area. pacing back and forth in her signature navy blazer. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she was clutching her phone like a weapon. She looked like someone preparing for battle. "It's okay, Maya," I said, standing up from my desk. "She's actually my sister. But yes, stay close to your desk, and if things get heated, feel free to call building security." Maya nodded and stepped aside as I walked toward the reception area. Rachel spotted me immediately and marched over with the kind of determined stride that meant she'd rehearsed this confrontation multiple times. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "Now." "Good morning to you too, Rachel," I replied calmly. "What can I do for you? You can start by explaining what the hell you think you're doing. That email you sent to the family? Dad had to take blood pressure medication after reading it. Mom hasn't stopped crying. You've turned everyone against me." I gestured toward my office. "Why don't we discuss this privately?" Rachel followed me into my office, and I closed the door behind us. She immediately began pacing again, her agitation filling the small space like static electricity. "You need to fix this, Jess. I've been blacklisted from every major consulting firm in Chicago. Marcus Wellington has connections everywhere, and he's made sure that everyone knows I'm not trustworthy. My career is over." I sat down behind my desk and studied my sister's face. For the first time in our relationship, she looked genuinely desperate. The confident superiority that had always characterized her demeanor was gone, replaced by something raw and panicked. "I'm sorry that you're facing professional consequences," I said carefully. "But those consequences are the result of your actions, not mine." "My actions?" Rachel's voice rose to nearly a shout. "You set me up. You recorded me without my knowledge and then played it back to humiliate me in front of my boss." "I recorded a business meeting where you made false statements about my qualifications and track record. Marcus Wellington fired you because you violated the trust required for your position, not because I humiliated you." Rachel stopped pacing and leaned forward, placing her hands on my desk. "You planned this. You knew I worked at Wellington. You knew I'd want to sit in on your presentation, and you set the whole thing up to make me look bad." I felt a moment of genuine surprise. In Rachel's version of events, I was the manipulative mastermind who had orchestrated her downfall. She couldn't even conceive of a scenario where her own actions had natural consequences. "Rachel," I said slowly, "I didn't invite you to my presentation. You showed up uninvited and immediately began undermining my credibility with false information. I recorded the meeting because I sensed something was wrong, which turned out to be accurate. Everything that happened after that was your choice. But you could have warned me that you were recording. You could have told me to stop. Why would I warn someone who was actively sabotaging my business presentation? Why would I tell you to stop when you were revealing exactly who you are?" Rachel straightened up, and I saw a flash of the old arrogance return to her expression. "Fine. You want to play hardball? I can play hardball too." She pulled out her phone and opened what looked like a social media app. "I've been documenting everything that's happened. The way you've turned our family against each other, the way you've destroyed my career out of petty jealousy, the way you've used underhanded tactics to advance your own business." She turned the phone toward me, showing me a Facebook post with several paragraphs of text and what looked like dozens of comments. "I've got support from people who understand what really happened here. People who know that family loyalty should come before business success. You're not going to get away with this." I glanced at the post without reading it in detail. Even from a distance, I could see that it was positioned as a victim narrative. Rachel as the wronged sister, me as the calculating opportunist who had betrayed family bonds for professional gain. "Rachel," I said, closing my laptop and giving her my full attention, "let me ask you something. Do you actually believe the version of events you've posted online?" "What do you mean?" "Do you genuinely believe that you were trying to help me during that presentation? That your comments about my company being just me and a couple of freelancers and my track record being problematic were motivated by concern for my welfare? Rachel's face flushed slightly. I was being honest about legitimate concerns. No, you weren't. You were systematically lying to sabotage my business opportunity. And we both know it. I was not lying. Rachel. I opened my laptop and pulled up the recording app. Would you like me to play back the part where you told Marcus that I had project delivery issues with Hartwell Manufacturing? Because I have Hartwell's written recommendation right here stating that I delivered ahead of schedule and under budget. Rachel's mouth opened and closed silently. Or would you prefer to hear the part where you called my financial projections unrealistic, when you'd never seen them and had no basis for that assessment? I was expressing general concerns about. You were lying. Deliberately and systematically. And the reason you were lying is because my success threatens your identity as the superior sister. Rachel sank into the chair across from my desk, and for a moment, she looked genuinely deflated. You don't understand what it's like, she said quietly. You've always been the creative one, the one with big dreams and unlimited potential. I had to work twice as hard just to get noticed, just to prove that I was smart enough and capable enough to deserve respect. I felt a flicker of sympathy, but I pushed it aside. This was another manipulation tactic, the vulnerability play that would make me feel guilty for defending myself. Rachel, you didn't have to work harder to get noticed. You were the golden child from day one. Mom and Dad celebrated every one of your achievements and questioned every one of mine. You've been the family success story for 3 decades. But that's just it, Rachel said, looking up at me with what appeared to be genuine pain. I was successful in the traditional way. Good grades, prestigious job, following the expected path. But you were building something real, something innovative. When I saw your Wellington proposal, I realized that you'd become the kind of business person I'd always wanted to be. I stared at my sister, trying to process what she'd just said. So you decided to destroy it? I panicked. I thought if I could raise some concerns about your readiness for such a big contract, maybe Marcus would give you a smaller project to start with, something more manageable. I thought I was protecting you from taking on too much too soon. It was a masterful performance. Rachel had taken her sabotage and reframed it as protective concern, her jealousy and repositioned it as sisterly love. If I didn't have the recording, I might have been tempted to believe her. Rachel, I said, opening the audio file on my laptop, let me play back exactly what you said, and then you can tell me if it sounds like someone trying to protect her sister. I played the segment where Rachel told Marcus that I was struggling to find my footing and had some setbacks recently. Her voice came through the speakers with unmistakable satisfaction, each lie delivered with confidence and conviction. When it finished, Rachel was silent for a long moment. Okay, she said finally. Maybe I went too far. Maybe I let my own insecurities affect my judgment. But Jess, I'm your sister. We should be able to work through this without destroying each other. We're not destroying each other, Rachel. You tried to destroy me, and when that backfired, you faced consequences. There's a difference. So what now? You're going to let my career be ruined over one mistake? I leaned back in my chair and considered the question. What did I want to happen next? For years, I'd absorbed Rachel's sabotage and manipulation because I'd believed that family harmony was more important than my own well-being. But now I had proof that Rachel would go to extraordinary lengths to undermine my success. I'm not going to let anything happen to your career, I said. Your career is your responsibility, just like mine is my responsibility. But I'm also not going to help you repair the damage you caused through your own choices. But you could talk to Marcus. You could explain that there was a misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding. You lied about my qualifications to my potential client. Marcus Wellington fired you because he can't trust someone who would do that. And frankly, neither can I. Rachel's face hardened again. Fine. If you won't help me fix this, I'll find other ways to protect myself. What's that supposed to mean? It means that your precious Wellington contract isn't as secure as you think it is. I still have friends at the company, people who know the real story about what happened. If you think you can just move forward like nothing happened, you're mistaken. I felt a chill run down my spine. Rachel was threatening to continue her sabotage, to find new ways to undermine my business relationship with Wellington Industries. Rachel, I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. Are you threatening to interfere with my Wellington contract? I'm telling you that actions have consequences. You want to play in the big leagues? Then you need to understand that the big leagues can be dangerous for people who don't know how to protect themselves. That was it. The moment when any lingering sympathy I had for Rachel evaporated completely. She wasn't a sister who had made a mistake. She was someone who would continue to sabotage me as long as she had the opportunity. I opened my laptop and began typing an email. "What are you doing?" Rachel asked. "I'm sending this recording to Marcus Wellington's legal department, along with a summary of our conversation today. I'm also forwarding it to HR at Wellington Industries with a note that you've threatened to continue interfering with my business relationship with the company. You can't do that." "I absolutely can. And I'm also going to recommend that they add a clause to my contract specifying that any former employees who attempt to interfere with the project will be subject to legal action for tortious interference with business relationships." Rachel went pale. "Jess, you're going nuclear over something that can be resolved with a simple conversation?" "No, Rachel. I'm protecting my business from someone who has explicitly threatened to sabotage it. This isn't going nuclear. This is basic professional self-defense." I hit send on the email and then opened another document. "I'm also drafting a formal letter to our family," I continued, "explaining that you came to my office today and threatened to continue undermining my business relationships. I want everyone to understand that this isn't a simple sibling disagreement. It's a pattern of professional sabotage that you've committed to continuing." "Stop," Rachel said, standing up abruptly. "Just stop. You're being vindictive and petty." "I'm being strategic and protective? There's a difference." Rachel headed for the door, then turned back to face me. "You think you've won something here, but you haven't. You've just turned your entire family against you for a business contract that could disappear tomorrow. Was it worth it?" I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and realized that I was seeing her clearly for the first time in our relationship. Not as the successful older sister whose approval I craved, not as the family golden child whose achievements I admired, but as someone who would sacrifice my well-being to protect her own ego. "Yes," I said simply. "It was worth it." After Rachel left, I sat in my office for a long time, processing what had just happened. She hadn't come to apologize or to take responsibility for her actions. She'd come to threaten me and to demand that I repair the damage she'd caused. More importantly, she'd revealed that this wasn't over. Rachel saw my success as an ongoing threat that needed to be managed or eliminated. As long as she had access to my professional network, she would continue looking for ways to undermine my reputation and sabotage my opportunities. I opened my contact list and began making calls. First to my lawyer, to discuss protective measures and potential legal remedies, then to my insurance agent, to review my professional liability coverage. Finally, to a private investigator recommended by my lawyer, to document any attempts Rachel might make to interfere with my business relationships. By the end of the day, I had created a comprehensive defense strategy that would protect my business from further sabotage, while ensuring that any attempts Rachel made to interfere would be documented and legally actionable. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was taking control of the situation entirely. Rachel had spent years using my desire for family harmony to get away with undermining my success. Now she was discovering what happened when I stopped prioritizing her comfort over my own protection. The game had changed, and for the first time in our relationship, I was the one setting the rules. The full force of my family's reaction hit me like a tsunami exactly 1 week after Rachel's office visit. I was reviewing quarterly projections when my phone started buzzing with an incoming call from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. Jessa Chen? The voice was sharp, professional, and unfamiliar. Speaking. This is attorney Patricia Hendricks from Hendricks, Walsh & Associates. I'm calling on behalf of my client, Rachel Morrison, regarding the defamatory statements you've made about her professional conduct. I felt my stomach drop, but kept my voice steady. I'm sorry, what defamatory statements? According to my client, you've been circulating false information about her termination from Wellington Industries, including audio recordings that were obtained without her consent. Illinois has strict laws about recording conversations without all parties' knowledge. I almost laughed. Rachel had hired a lawyer to intimidate me, but she'd clearly chosen someone who didn't understand the basics of Illinois recording law. Ms. Hendricks, I said calmly, Illinois is a one-party consent state. I was legally entitled to record a business meeting that I was participating in. And I haven't made any false statements about your client's termination. I've simply shared documented evidence of her attempt to sabotage my business presentation. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Regardless of the legality of the recording, you've used it to damage my client's professional reputation. We're prepared to file suit for tortious interference with prospective economic advantage. Your client threatened to continue interfering with my business relationships during a meeting in my office last week. I have that conversation documented. As well, if anyone has engaged in tortious interference, it's Ms. Morrison. Another pause, longer this time. We'll be in touch, Ms. Chen. The line went dead. I immediately called my own attorney, David Kim, and filled him in on the conversation. Standard intimidation tactic, he said after I'd finished explaining. Rachel's lawyer is fishing to see if you'll back down. The fact that they're threatening to sue for tortious interference when Rachel is the one who actually committed tortious interference suggests they don't have a strong case. So what do? We document everything and prepare for them to escalate. I'll draft a response letter outlining our position and making it clear that we're prepared to defend against any frivolous litigation. But Jessa, you should know that this is probably just the beginning. David was right. Over the next few days, the pressure campaign intensified from multiple directions. First came the family intervention. I arrived home from work on Thursday to find my parents' car parked outside my building. Mom and Dad were sitting in my lobby, looking like they'd been waiting for hours. We need to talk, Dad said without preamble. His face was grim, and Mom looked like she'd been crying. I led them up to my apartment, already knowing that this conversation was going to test every boundary I'd established over the past 2 weeks. Jessa, Mom began as soon as we were seated in my living room, this has gone too far. Rachel's lawyer called us. She's talking about lawsuits and court proceedings. Our family is falling apart. Mom, Rachel hired a lawyer to intimidate me because I documented her attempt to sabotage my business. I'm not the one who escalated this to legal threats. But you're the one who started it, Dad interjected. If you had just handled this privately, as a family matter, none of this would be happening. I looked at my father, a man who had spent 40 years building his own successful accounting practice, and realized that he fundamentally didn't understand what Rachel had done to me. Dad, I said, if one of your clients hired someone to attend your meetings with other clients and deliberately spread false information about your qualifications and track record, would you handle that as a family matter? That's different. That would be a clear case of professional sabotage. He stopped mid-sentence as he realized what he'd just said. Exactly. It would be professional sabotage, which is exactly what Rachel did to me. But she's your sister, Mom said desperately. Surely there's a way to resolve this without destroying her career and tearing the family apart. I didn't destroy Rachel's career. Rachel destroyed her own career by lying to her boss about a potential business partner. And I'm not tearing the family apart. I'm simply refusing to participate in a dynamic where my success is treated as a threat that needs to be managed. The conversation continued for 2 hours, with my parents alternating between guilt trips, emotional manipulation, and increasingly desperate attempts to convince me to be the bigger person. They painted Rachel as fragile and misguided, me as vindictive and cold. They talked about family loyalty and forgiveness as if those concepts only applied to my behavior, not Rachel's. When they finally left, I was emotionally drained but clear. About one thing: my parents would never acknowledge that Rachel's behavior was fundamentally wrong. In their worldview, family harmony was more important than individual integrity, and I was expected to sacrifice the latter to preserve the former. The next attack came through social media. Rachel had apparently expanded her victim narrative beyond Facebook, creating accounts on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram to share her story about being destroyed by family betrayal. She'd crafted a compelling narrative about sibling rivalry, professional jealousy, and the devastating consequences of cancel culture in corporate America. The posts were masterfully written, full of emotional appeals and carefully crafted half-truths. She positioned herself as someone who had made a minor mistake in judgment and was now facing disproportionate consequences because of her sister's vindictive nature. She talked about the difficulty of finding new employment, the shame of explaining, her termination to potential employers, and the pain of being rejected by her own family. What made the posts particularly effective was that Rachel never directly lied. She talked about offering honest feedback during my presentation, without mentioning that her feedback was based on false information. She described being unexpectedly recorded, without acknowledging that the recording had captured her making demonstrably untrue statements. She characterized my refusal to help repair her situation as choosing business over family, without explaining that helping her would have required me to lie to my client. The response was exactly what Rachel had hoped for. Comments poured in expressing sympathy for her situation and outrage at my behavior. People who had never met either of us were calling me calculating, manipulative, and heartless. Professional connections who knew me only through social media began viewing my posts with suspicion. Most concerning was the fact that several people in Chicago's business community were sharing Rachel's posts and adding their own commentary about the importance of family loyalty and the dangers of success going to someone's head. My assistant Maya came into my office Friday morning with a printed stack of screenshots. "I thought you should see these," she said, setting them on my desk. "Some of these people are connected to potential clients." I flipped through the screenshots, feeling my stomach sink with each one. Rachel's narrative was spreading through my professional network like wildfire, and I had no way to respond without looking defensive or vindictive. "What do you want to do?" Maya asked. I thought about it for a moment. The traditional response would be to ignore the social media campaign and hope it would blow over. But Rachel wasn't going to stop. She'd found a way to damage my reputation without making direct false statements, and she was going to keep pushing until she either destroyed my business or forced me to capitulate. "Get me a meeting with our PR consultant," I said. "And call David Kim. We need to discuss our options for a defamation claim. Are you sure? Once you respond publicly, this becomes a full-scale war." "Maya, this already is a full-scale war. Rachel just started shooting first." The PR meeting was enlightening in ways I hadn't expected. Jennifer Walsh, our consultant, reviewed Rachel's social media campaign with the practiced eye of someone who'd handled dozens of similar situations. "She's good," Jennifer said bluntly. "This is a professionally crafted reputation assassination. Someone with real expertise helped her develop this strategy." "What do you mean?" "Look at the timing of the posts, the platforms she's chosen, the way she's leveraging emotional triggers while staying just shy of actionable statements. This isn't random venting. This is strategic character destruction. I felt a chill run through me. You think she hired a PR firm? I think she hired someone who specializes in this kind of campaign. The question is, how far is she willing to take it? We got our answer that afternoon. I was in a client meeting when Maya knocked on the conference room door with an expression of barely controlled panic. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but we have a situation. There are protesters outside the building." Through my office window, I could see about 20 people gathered on the sidewalk below, carrying signs with messages like "Family Before," "Profit," and "Corporate Greed Destroys Lives." At the center of the group, speaking into a megaphone, was Rachel. "She's giving interviews to local news," Maya continued. "Channel 5 is already here, and I think I saw a Tribune reporter in the crowd." Excused myself from the meeting and went to the window for a better look. Rachel was dressed in simple clothes, jeans and a sweater instead of her usual business attire, and she looked tired and vulnerable. She was telling the gathered crowd about losing her job because of family politics and being blacklisted by her own sister. The optics were perfect. Rachel looked like David fighting Goliath, while I was literally looking down at her from my corporate office tower. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Enjoying the show? This is just the beginning. Stop now and I'll call them off." I showed the message to Maya. "Call building security and make sure they keep the protesters on public property. Then get David Kim on the phone." "What are you going to do?" I looked down at Rachel, surrounded by supporters and news cameras, playing the victim with Oscar-worthy performance skills. 6 months ago, this would have devastated me. The public humiliation, the family drama, the professional consequences. I would have crumbled under the pressure and given her whatever she wanted. But I wasn't the same person who had stood in that airport gate, accepting exclusion as the price of family membership. I was someone who had built a business worth defending, who had clients counting on my integrity, who had learned that some battles were worth fighting even when they were painful. "I'm going to let her show everyone exactly who she is," I said, "and then I'm going to show them who I am." Within hours, Rachel's protest had generated local news coverage with headlines like "Sister versus Sister," "When Family Loyalty Clashes with Corporate Success," and "Whistleblower Claims Retaliation After Challenging Sister's Business Practices." The stories were devastating. Rachel came across as articulate and sympathetic, while I was portrayed as someone who had chosen business success over family relationships. The reporters had clearly been given background information about our family dynamic, and they painted a picture of long-standing sibling rivalry that had finally exploded into public view. But they'd also made a crucial mistake. In their eagerness to present a compelling human interest story, they'd accepted Rachel's version of events without investigating the underlying facts. They'd described her as a whistleblower who had been fired for raising concerns about her sister's business practices, when the reality was that she'd been fired for making false statements to sabotage a business opportunity. That evening, I called an emergency meeting with my core team: Maya, David Kim, Jennifer Walsh, and my business partner Alex Rivera, who handled our technical operations. "Here's what we're dealing with," I said, spreading the day's news coverage across the conference table. "Rachel has launched a comprehensive campaign to destroy my reputation and force me to capitulate to her demands. She's using social media, legal intimidation, family pressure, and now public protests and media coverage." "What's the endgame?" Alex asked. "What does she actually want?" "She wants me to call Marcus Wellington and tell him that there was a misunderstanding, that she shouldn't have been fired, and that I was the one who escalated the situation inappropriately. She wants her job back and my reputation damaged enough that I'm no longer a threat to her status as the family success story. And if you don't, she's made it clear that she'll continue escalating until she either gets what she wants or destroys my business in the process." David leaned back in his chair. "The good news is that she's overplayed her hand. The protest today, the coordinated media campaign, She's moved beyond protected speech into what looks like organized harassment. We have grounds for a restraining order and potentially a malicious prosecution claim. But? I could hear the hesitation in his voice. But fighting this publicly is going to be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally brutal. Even if we win, the process will generate more negative publicity and keep this story in the news for months. Jennifer nodded. From a PR perspective, defending yourself against family members is always tricky. No matter how justified your position is, there's a perception that you should be able to resolve family disputes privately. I looked around the room at the people who had helped me build my business from nothing into something worth defending. They were all waiting for me to make a decision that would affect not just my future, but theirs as well. I need to ask you all something, I said. Are you willing to fight this with me? Because if we're going to do this, we need to do it all the way. No half measures, no backing down when it gets ugly. Maya was the first to respond. I've seen what you've built here, Jessa. I've seen how you treat clients, how you handle challenges, how you've created a workplace where people can do their best work. Rachel is lying about who you are, and I'm not okay with that. Alex nodded. I've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs. Most of them would have crumbled under this kind of pressure weeks ago. The fact that you're still standing, still focused on protecting the business and the team tells me everything I need to know about your character. David smiled grimly. I've been practicing law for 20 years. I can count on one hand the number of clients who've been this clearly in the right. Let's make Rachel regret that she chose to fight someone who actually knows how to fight back. Jennifer was quiet for a moment, then spoke slowly. Rachel has created a narrative where she's the victim and you're the villain. But narratives can be changed if you have the right facts and the right strategy. I think we can turn this around. But it's going to require us to play offense instead of defense. I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not fear, but clarity. Rachel had spent years conditioning me to believe that I was weak, that I needed her approval, that I should accept whatever treatment she decided to give me. She'd counted on that conditioning to make me fold under pressure. She was about to discover how much I'd changed. All right, I said. Let's show everyone what really happened. And let's make sure that when this is over, no one will ever doubt that truth matters more than family politics. The war was about to begin in earnest. Crew. Counterattack began at 6 a.m. on Monday morning with a carefully coordinated media blitz that Rachel never saw coming. While she was probably sleeping off the adrenaline high from her weekend protest coverage, my team was already 3 moves ahead. Jennifer Walsh had spent the entire weekend crafting what she called a truth bomb, a comprehensive presentation of facts that would systematically dismantle Rachel's victim narrative. But instead of playing defense, we were going on the offensive with a story that was much bigger than sibling rivalry. Corporate ethics under fire. When family members abuse. Insider access was the headline of the press release that went out to every major business publication in Chicago at dawn. The story wasn't about me versus Rachel. It was about a critical business ethics issue that every company needed to understand. The press release included carefully selected excerpts from the recording of Rachel's sabotage attempt, legal analysis of her violation of fiduciary duty to Wellington Industries, and expert commentary from business ethics professors at Northwestern and University of Chicago about the broader implications of her behavior. Most importantly, it included Marcus Wellington's statement supporting my version of events. Marcus had agreed to go on record after David Kim explained how Rachel's media campaign was potentially damaging Wellington Industries' reputation by suggesting they'd fired an employee for whistleblowing rather than for professional misconduct. Ms. Morrison was terminated because she made demonstrably false statements about a potential business partner during a formal presentation. Marcus's statement read, "We have audio documentation of these false statements, and we terminated her employment because we cannot trust someone who would abuse their position to sabotage business relationships." Ms. Chen's handling of this situation has been entirely professional and we look forward to continuing our partnership with her firm. By 8 a.m., the story was picked up by the Chicago Tribune's business section. By 10 a.m., it was trending on LinkedIn. By noon, it had been shared by 3 business ethics organizations and 2 professional consulting associations. The narrative had completely flipped. Instead of a family dispute that had gotten out of hand, this was now a case study in professional integrity and corporate governance. Rachel went from sympathetic victim to cautionary tale in less than 6 hours. My phone started ringing with interview requests from business publications that wanted to discuss the broader implications of insider sabotage and family conflicts of interest in professional settings. I accepted 3 interviews, each one focused on the business ethics issues rather than the personal drama. The challenge for companies, I told the Wall Street Journal's Chicago correspondent, is that family relationships can create blind spots in professional judgment. When someone uses their family connection to gather intelligence about business opportunities and then uses that intelligence to sabotage those opportunities, it represents a fundamental violation of professional trust. The interviewer pressed me about the personal cost of taking such a hard line against my own sister. The personal cost of allowing professional sabotage is always higher than the cost of addressing it directly, I replied. If I had prioritized family harmony over business integrity, I would have taught everyone in my professional network that my boundaries are negotiable and my principles are conditional. That's not sustainable for any business relationship. By Wednesday, Rachel's lawyer called my lawyer to discuss potential resolution options. The intimidation tactics had evaporated, replaced by damage control strategies. Rachel's social media campaign had backfired spectacularly as business professionals began sharing their own stories about family members who had crossed professional boundaries. But the most satisfying development came from an unexpected source. I was reviewing implementation timelines for the Wellington project when Maya knocked on my door with an expression I couldn't read. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "Claims to be a former colleague of Rachel's from Wellington. Says he has information you might find interesting." The man who walked into my office was about 40, well-dressed, with the kind of confident demeanor that suggested senior management experience. He introduced himself as Robert Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, and said he'd been director of operations at Wellington Industries until he'd left for a competitor 6 months ago. "I need to tell you something about your sister's employment at Wellington," he said without preamble. "Something that Marcus Wellington probably doesn't know." I gestured for him to sit down, already sensing that whatever he was about to tell me would be significant. "Rachel wasn't just gathering intelligence about your Wellington proposal," Robert continued. "She was systematically undermining several potential vendor relationships, always with the same pattern, raising concerns about their capabilities, questioning their track record, suggesting that Wellington should go with more established options." He pulled out a folder and placed it on my desk. I started documenting it after the 3rd incident because it seemed like she was actively working against the company's best interests. But when I brought it to Marcus's attention, Rachel convinced him that I was the one with poor judgment. Opened the folder and found detailed notes about Rachel's interference with vendor selection processes, including emails where she'd made false or misleading statements about potential partners' qualifications. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because when I saw the news coverage about your situation, I realized that what happened to you was part of a much bigger pattern. Rachel wasn't protecting Wellington Industries from bad vendors. She was protecting her own position by ensuring that no one could succeed well enough to make her look ineffective by comparison." The documentation Robert provided was devastating. It showed that Rachel had been systematically sabotaging business relationships for months, not just with me, but with multiple potential partners and vendors. She'd cost Wellington Industries several promising opportunities by raising false concerns about prospective partners' capabilities. More importantly, it showed that when Robert had tried to address the pattern, Rachel had turned the situation around and made him look like the problem. He'd ultimately left Wellington Industries because she'd successfully undermined his credibility with senior management. "There's something else," Robert said, reaching into his briefcase. "I have contacts at 3 other companies where Rachel worked before Wellington. I made some calls after seeing the news coverage. The pattern goes back years." He handed me a second folder containing testimonials from former colleagues at Rachel's previous employers. The stories were remarkably consistent. Rachel would identify high-performing colleagues who might threaten her status, then systematically undermine their credibility through false concerns about their judgment, reliability, or professional capabilities. She'd destroyed the career of a rising star at her previous consulting firm by spreading rumors about his client relationships. She'd sabotaged a female colleague's promotion by raising questions about her ability to handle pressure. She'd even convinced a former employer to pass over a qualified internal candidate for a management position by suggesting that the candidate had personal issues that would affect her performance. "She's a professional saboteur," Robert said bluntly, "and she's been doing this for years. What happened to you wasn't personal jealousy. It was her standard operating procedure for dealing with anyone who might outshine her." I stared at the documentation, feeling a mix of vindication and horror. Rachel's attack on me hadn't been a moment of weakness or a family dispute that had gotten out of hand. It was the latest example of a career-long pattern of destroying other people's opportunities to protect her own position. "Why hasn't anyone exposed this before?" I asked. "Because she's careful about targeting people who can't fight back effectively. You're the first person with enough documentation and enough resources to make a real case. Most of her previous victims were either too junior to be believed or too afraid of retaliation to speak up." I called David Kim immediately and scheduled an emergency meeting to review the new evidence. By Thursday afternoon, we had a comprehensive dossier showing Rachel's pattern of professional sabotage spanning multiple employers and dozens of victims. David was practically salivating as he reviewed the documentation. "This changes everything. We're not just talking about one incident of poor judgment. We're talking about a systematic pattern of professional misconduct that probably violates multiple employment agreements and potentially criminal fraud statutes. What are our options? We can file a civil suit for damages. But more importantly, we can refer this to state prosecutors for criminal investigation. If Rachel has been making false statements to interfere with business relationships as a pattern of behavior, she may have committed wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy charges." That evening, I called Marcus Wellington personally to share the new information. His response was immediate and decisive. "I want Rachel prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law," he said, "and I want you to coordinate with our legal department to ensure that every one of her former victims has the opportunity to seek justice. This kind of behavior is cancerous in the business community." But the most profound change wasn't in the legal proceedings or the media coverage. It was in my own family's response to the mounting evidence. My parents called on Friday evening, their voices subdued and uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. "Jessa," Mom said hesitantly, "we've been reading the news stories about Rachel's pattern of behavior. We had no idea." "We thought this was just about sibling rivalry," Dad added. "We didn't understand that she'd been systematically hurting people's careers for years." I felt a moment of satisfaction, but it was tempered by sadness. My parents were finally seeing Rachel clearly, but only because her victims had been strangers rather than their own daughter. "The thing is," I said carefully, "she's been doing this to me our entire lives. The only difference is that now there's documentation and witnesses." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "We owe you an apology," Mom said finally. "We enabled her behavior because we didn't want to see it for what it was. We taught you that family loyalty meant accepting whatever treatment Rachel decided to give you, and we were wrong. We're proud of you for standing up to her," Dad added, "and we're sorry it took us so long to understand what you were dealing with." The conversation lasted for 2 hours, with my parents asking detailed questions about Rachel's past behavior and acknowledging instance after instance where they'd dismissed my concerns or pressured me to accommodate her manipulation. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like my parents actually saw me as an individual with legitimate boundaries and reasonable expectations for how I should be treated. But the most unexpected development came on Saturday morning when my grandmother called. "Sweetheart," Grandma Betty said, "I need to tell you something that I probably should have told you years ago." "What's that, Grandma?" Rachel came to me after your college graduation and asked me to convince your parents not to help you start your business. She said you weren't ready for that kind of responsibility, and that it would be better for everyone if you got more experience working for other people first. I felt my stomach drop. "What did you tell her?" I told her that it wasn't her decision to make, and that if she was really concerned about your welfare, she should support your dreams instead of trying to limit them. But I think she found other ways to undermine your plans without involving me. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I want you to know that someone in this family has always believed in your potential, even when others couldn't see it. And I want you to know that you were right to trust your instincts about Rachel. She's been working against your success for much longer than any of us realized." By Sunday evening, I had received apology calls from every member of my extended family, except Rachel herself. Cousins, aunts, uncles, even family friends who had heard about the situation. Everyone wanted to acknowledge that they'd misjudged the situation and express support for my decision to defend myself. The family dynamic that had defined my entire life had completely reversed. Instead of being the family disappointment who needed to be managed and contained, I was now seen as the family member who had finally stood up to a bully that everyone else had been too intimidated or too blind to confront. Rachel, meanwhile, had gone completely silent. No more social media posts, no more lawyer letters, no more protests or media interviews. Her attorney had quietly withdrawn from representing her, presumably because she could no longer pay his fees, or because he'd realized that her position was legally indefensible. The private investigator I'd hired reported that Rachel had moved out of her Chicago apartment and was apparently staying with a friend in Minneapolis. Her LinkedIn profile had been deleted, and she seemed to have completely withdrawn from public view. On Monday morning, exactly 3 weeks after the Wellington Industries presentation that had started everything, I sat in my office reviewing the final contract terms for what was now a $15 million project. Marcus had expanded the scope after seeing my team's preliminary analysis. Maya knocked on my door with the morning's mail, including a thick envelope from the Illinois State Attorney's Office. Inside was a formal notification that Rachel Morrison was being investigated for wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy charges related to her pattern of professional sabotage. I set the letter aside and opened my laptop to review the project timeline that would occupy the next 2 years of my life. The Wellington Industries contract wasn't just a business success. It was proof that integrity and competence could triumph over manipulation and sabotage. But more importantly, it was proof that I'd finally become the person I'd always had the potential to be. Someone who refused to accept limitations imposed by other people's insecurities, someone who fought for what she'd earned, someone who understood that protecting your own success was just as important as achieving it in the first place. Rachel had tried to teach me that family loyalty meant accepting whatever treatment she decided to give me. Instead, she'd taught me that real loyalty, to myself, to my team, to my clients, meant refusing to enable behavior that hurt everyone involved. The transformation was complete. I was no longer the little sister who apologized for her own success. I was the CEO who had built something worth defending, and who had learned exactly how to defend it. 18 months after the Wellington Industries presentation that changed everything, I stood in the conference room of my new downtown Chicago office, looking out at Lake Michigan through floor-to-ceiling windows. The space was 3 times larger than my previous office, with room for the 22 employees who now made up Chen Strategic Solutions. On the wall behind my desk hung a framed copy of the Chicago Tribune business section from 8 months ago with the headline, "Local Consulting Firm Wins National Ethics Award." Below that was a letter from the Illinois State Attorney's Office, formally notifying me that Rachel Morrison had been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for wire fraud and conspiracy charges related to her systematic interference with business relationships. But the most meaningful item in my office wasn't on the wall. It was sitting on my desk. A handwritten thank you note from Jessica Kim, a young consultant who had been one of Rachel's victims at her previous firm. Jessica had reached out after the criminal investigation became public, sharing her own story of how Rachel had destroyed her promotion prospects with false allegations about her client management skills. "Thank you for having the courage to fight back," Jessica had written. "Because of you, I finally understood that what happened to me wasn't my fault, and I had the strength to rebuild my career. I'm now a partner at Morrison & Associates, and I think about your example every time I face a difficult professional decision." The note was one of dozens I'd received from Rachel's former victims, people who had spent years blaming themselves for career setbacks that were actually the result of deliberate sabotage. Many of them had found the courage to speak up after seeing the media coverage of my case, leading to additional criminal charges and civil suits against Rachel. Maya knocked on my door, interrupting my reflection. "Your 2:00 is here," she said with a smile. "And congratulations again on the Harvard Business Review feature. I've already gotten 3 interview requests from MBA programs that want to add your case to their business ethics curriculum." The Harvard Business Review article had been the capstone of a remarkable year. When family becomes the competition, a case study in professional boundary setting has become one of their most shared articles, used in business schools across the country to teach students about conflict of interest, professional integrity, and the importance of documentation in workplace disputes. But today's meeting wasn't about media coverage or academic recognition. It was about the future. Marcus Wellington walked into my office with the same confident presence he'd had during that first disastrous presentation, but his demeanor toward me had evolved from polite professionalism to genuine respect. The Wellington Industries project had exceeded every expectation, saving the company $12 million in its first year and positioning them as an industry leader in sustainable supply chain management. "Jessa," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk, "I have a proposition for you." "I'm listening." "Wellington Industries is expanding into European markets, and we need a consulting partner who can help us navigate the regulatory environment while maintaining the efficiency improvements you've implemented here. It's a 5-year contract, $45 million, with the potential for expansion into Asian markets if the European launch goes well." I felt my breath catch. $45 million would transform Chen Strategic Solutions from a successful boutique firm into a major player in the international consulting market. "There's one condition," Marcus continued. "We want exclusive rights to your supply chain optimization methodology for the manufacturing sector. We're prepared to pay a licensing fee on top of the consulting contract." I leaned back in my chair, processing the offer. 2 years ago, I'd been standing at an airport gate, listening to my family laugh as they excluded me from a vacation I'd helped plan and pay for. Now I was being offered a contract that would make my firm one of the most successful independent consulting companies in the Midwest. "Marcus," I said, "I'm honored by the offer, and I'm definitely interested. But I need to discuss the exclusivity terms with my team before I can give you a final answer." "Of course. Take all the time you need. But Jessa, I want you to know something. Working with you and your team has been one of the best business decisions I've ever made. Not just because of the results you've delivered, but because of the integrity you've brought to every aspect of the relationship. That's rare in this industry." After Marcus left, I called an emergency meeting with my senior team. Alex Rivera, who had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer 6 months earlier, was the first to speak. "This is incredible, Jess. $45 million would put us in the same league as McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group." "But," I could hear the hesitation in his voice, "but the exclusivity clause concerns me. If we lock ourselves into manufacturing supply chain work exclusively for Wellington, we limit our ability to grow in other directions. Maya, who had been promoted to Director of Client Relations, nodded in agreement. We've been getting inquiries from healthcare systems, universities, even government agencies. The methodology you developed for Wellington could be adapted for any complex organization, not just manufacturing. David Kim, who had become our in-house legal counsel after successfully defending me against Rachel's attacks, pulled out his laptop. I think we can negotiate modified exclusivity terms. Maybe sector-specific exclusivity for manufacturing, but freedom to work with other industries. For the next 3 hours, we analyzed the Wellington offer from every angle, discussing growth, strategies, risk assessments, and long-term goals for the company. It was the kind of strategic planning session I'd dreamed about during my early days as an entrepreneur, when I was working alone and wondering if I'd ever build something significant. But what struck me most about the meeting wasn't the sophistication of our analysis or the magnitude of the opportunity, it was the culture we'd created. Everyone felt free to express concerns, challenge assumptions, and propose alternative approaches. There was no hierarchy of ideas, no politics, no sabotage or manipulation. We'd built exactly the kind of workplace I'd always wanted to be part of, one where success was shared, where talent was nurtured instead of threatened, where conflicts were addressed directly instead of being used as weapons. As the meeting wound down, Alex raised a question that had been on my mind for weeks. Jess, have you thought about what you want to do about the book deal? 3 months earlier, I'd been approached by a literary agent who wanted to represent me in writing a business memoir about the Rachel situation and its aftermath. Publishers were apparently interested in a book that combined professional development advice with a compelling personal story about family dynamics and business ethics. I'm still thinking about it, I said honestly. Part of me wants to share the lessons I've learned, especially for other entrepreneurs who might be dealing with family members who undermine their success. But part of me worries about reopening old wounds. What does your family think? Maya asked. That was a complicated question. My relationship with my parents had undergone a complete transformation over the past 18 months. They'd spent considerable time and effort understanding how they'd enabled Rachel's behavior, and they'd made genuine changes in how they approached family dynamics. Mom had started therapy to address her tendency to prioritize family harmony over individual boundaries. Dad had written me a long letter acknowledging specific instances where he'd dismissed my concerns about Rachel's behavior. Both of them had become vocal supporters of my business, regularly referring potential clients and celebrating my successes publicly. My extended family had also rallied around me in ways I'd never experienced before. Cousins who had always treated me as an afterthought were now asking for business advice and career guidance. Aunts and uncles who had dismissed my entrepreneurial ambitions were now pointing to my success as an example for their own children. Even my grandmother had played a role in the family's transformation. At her 85th birthday party 6 months ago, she stood up during the toast and said, "I want everyone to know how proud I am of Jessa for having the courage to stand up for herself and for showing all of us what real strength looks like." The only family member I hadn't spoken to was Rachel herself. She'd been released from federal prison 4 months ago, and according to my private investigator, she was living in a halfway house in Milwaukee and working at a nonprofit organization that helped formerly incarcerated women find employment. Her social media presence remained non-existent, and she'd made no attempts to contact me or any other family members. Part of me wondered if she'd genuinely changed during her incarceration, if she'd used the time to reflect on her behavior and develop genuine remorse for the people she'd hurt. But another part of me recognized that wondering about Rachel's transformation was a trap, the same trap I'd fallen into for decades, where I made her emotional state more important than my own boundaries. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hi, Jess. This is Michael Torres. I saw an article about your company in the Tribune. I'm so proud of what you've built. I would love to catch up over coffee sometime if you're interested. I stared at the message for a long moment, remembering the man Rachel had convinced me wasn't ambitious enough for my future. Michael had apparently started his own software development company 3 years ago and had recently secured venture capital funding for a revolutionary app that helped small businesses optimize their supply chains. He'd been ambitious all along. Rachel had just convinced me to see his supportive nature as weakness rather than strength. I typed back, "Hi, Michael. I'd love to catch up. How about Thursday at 3 p.m.? I know a great place in Lincoln Park." Over the next few days, I found myself thinking about the book proposal and what story I actually wanted to tell. It wasn't really about Rachel, I realized. It was about the process of recognizing your own worth, setting boundaries that reflect your values, and building something meaningful despite opposition from people you love. It was about learning the difference between family loyalty and family enabling, between success and security, between being liked and being respected. Most importantly, it was about understanding that sometimes the people who claim to love you are actually the ones holding you back from becoming who you're meant to be. Thursday afternoon, I met Michael at a coffee shop near the lake, curious about how it would feel to reconnect with someone from the part of my life when I'd been smaller, more uncertain, more willing to accept other people's assessments of my potential. He looked older, more confident, with the kind of calm authority that comes from building something from nothing and seeing it succeed. When he smiled at me across the table, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with nostalgia and everything to do with recognition. The recognition of someone who had traveled a similar path and emerged stronger. "So," he said after we'd caught up on the basics of our respective businesses, "I have to ask, do you ever regret how things played out with your family?" It was a question I'd been asking myself for months. Did I regret the pain my family had experienced? Did I regret the public exposure of Rachel's behavior? Did I regret choosing my professional integrity over family harmony? "I regret that it took me so long to recognize what was happening," I said finally. "I regret that other people got hurt because I didn't speak up sooner. But I don't regret defending myself, and I don't regret refusing to enable behavior that was fundamentally destructive, even though it cost you your relationship with Rachel." "Michael, I never had a real relationship with Rachel. I had a dynamic, where I provided resources and emotional support, and she provided criticism and sabotage disguised as concern. Ending that dynamic didn't cost me a relationship. It freed me from a prison I didn't even realize I was in." He nodded slowly. "I remember trying to tell you that she didn't seem to support your dreams. You got so defensive about it. Because she'd trained me to defend her behavior instead of questioning it. That's how effective manipulators work. They convince you that protecting them is the same thing as protecting yourself." We talked for 3 hours, sharing stories about building our businesses, navigating family expectations, and learning to trust our own judgment. By the time we parted ways, we'd made plans to collaborate on a project that would integrate his supply chain app with my consulting methodology. But more than that, I'd rediscovered what it felt like to be with someone who celebrated my success, instead of trying to manage it, who encouraged my ambitions instead of questioning them, who saw my strength as an asset rather than a threat. That evening, I called the literary agent and told her I was ready to write the book. Not as a memoir of victimhood or family drama, but as a guide for anyone who had ever been told they were too ambitious, too successful, or too independent for their own good. The title came to me as I was writing the first chapter. Family Business. When Love Becomes Competition and How to Choose Yourself. 6 months later, I was signing copies of the book at a launch event in downtown Chicago, surrounded by colleagues, clients, and family members who had learned to celebrate my success without conditions or caveats. My parents were there, beaming with pride as they watched me discuss business ethics and professional boundaries with a room full of entrepreneurs and executives. My grandmother, now 86 and still sharp as ever, sat in the front row taking pictures with her iPhone. Even some of Rachel's former victims attended, including Jessica Kim, who had driven down from Milwaukee to thank me in person for giving her the courage to rebuild her career. As I looked out at the crowd of people who had supported my journey, I realized that I'd accomplished something much more important than building a successful business or winning a high-profile legal case. I'd learned to value myself enough to demand respect from the people in my life. I'd built relationships based on mutual support rather than one-sided accommodation. I'd created a life where my success was celebrated rather than tolerated. Most importantly, I'd discovered that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Because when you refuse to accept limitations imposed by other people's insecurities, you give everyone around you permission to do the same. That night, as I cleaned up after the book launch, I found a note that someone had left on the signing table. It was from a young woman whose sister had been undermining her law school applications, and she wanted to thank me for showing her that family loyalty didn't require accepting sabotage. You helped me understand that protecting my dreams isn't mean, she'd written. It's survival. I smiled as I folded the note and put it in my purse. Tomorrow, I'd call the literary agent about a second book. There were still so many stories to tell, so many people who needed to hear that their success was worth defending. The girl who had stood at that airport gate, accepting exclusion as the price of family membership, was gone forever. In her place was a woman who understood that real love, for yourself and others, sometimes requires saying no to people who can't celebrate your yes. And that understanding had made all the difference. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.